want to share with you a bit about the Aqua Nation Israel, as I refer to it, and we'll get there, but I thought first you might want to hear a little bit about who I am, what I'm doing presenting to you. So, in order to answer that, I just moved from Israel to Colorado, and before I moved back to the States, a friend of mine says to me, never been to, first I had to explain to him that I wasn't going to Manhattan, New York. He never heard of Manhattan, Kansas. Thank God it's not Manhattan, New York. I prefer to be in Manhattan, Kansas. And he says, are you nervous? I said, nervous? I'm terrified. He said, you're terrified because you're Jewish and you're going to Kansas. I said, no, I'm not terrified because I'm Jewish and going to Kansas. They love Jews, and best friends are evangelical growing up. So you're nervous because you're Israeli. And the world doesn't always love Israel. I said, no, absolutely not. Governor Collier, sent over a delegation that we brought over last year to Israel for a ag tech tour. They're super pro-Israel. So why are you so nervous, he says. I'm nervous because I'm a Kansas Jayhawk. And I know it's not exactly, the school of choice here. So the truth of the matter is I'm a Nebraska Cornhusker, but that's just embarrassing these days to say. So I'm open, and I'm ready for a new team, although I got to say we're all pretty much pulling up the rear in each of our respective leagues now. So here's who I am. I'm Baruch HaLevi. None of my friends in the Midwest can say Baruch, so I ended up as B, whether it's Rabbi B or Dr. B or just B. I'm doing you a favor by not making you say the Baruch. I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, but I became a rabbi of a synagogue, as Tracy mentioned, for about 15 years. In that process, I realized I'm more of an entrepreneur than I am a synagogue rabbi. It became pretty clear when I started a cannabis company that went over like a lead balloon in a synagogue setting. But I started it because I was looking for a way to promote Israel. Israel's the birthplace of medical marijuana, born at Hebrew University, 1964. And most of the cannabis R&D is from Israel. And I was looking for a way to connect my two homelands, Israel, because I am Jewish and it is the Jewish homeland, and America. God bless America, and I'm American. And I thought there's a great opportunity, and I still think there is. I'll get to what welaunch is and how it's kind of morphed from a cannabis play to something much larger. But in order to do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about who Israel is. If I were to have time and we go around the room, I would ask you for I'm going to come out front. I'm not so great behind the podium. I'd ask you for your reactions to Israel. And you tell me things like, Israel is the birthplace of monotheism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and it is that. You tell me about, unfortunately, Hamas, terror, and that is true, though it's an incredibly safe place. I got to say, I feel oftentimes more safe there than I do in America. My daughters had no curfew, 10 years old. 10, 12 o'clock at night, walking home in the dark, never thought twice about it. Here, I would never let them do that. Well, Manhattan I might, but Denver I wouldn't. You'd tell me things about the past, about the Bible and history, and it's true, you can't throw a rock in Israel without hitting an archaeological site. And you'd tell me about camels and donkeys, and this is true, this was me taking my son to school last year on the family donkey. The camel was in the shop. Just kidding. My wife backed it into the garage. That's actually probably possible. That's a tourist trap. I got sucked in just like the rest of the tourists years back. That's not Israel, but this is Israel. Israel is a modern economic powerhouse. Now, 70 years ago, that was not the case. 70 years ago, the birth of Israel, 1948, they were exporting every year about $6 million worth of oranges and dentures. Why dentures? I guess a lot of Jewish dentists, I don't know. But now fast forward 70 years, and they passed the $100 billion mark last year, mostly not in dentures and oranges, mostly in high tech and other modern industries, to the point where Israel now is ranked as the 8th most powerful country in the world. I mean, little Israel. It has more companies on the NASDAQ, by the way, than any other country except for the US, makes sense, it's our stock exchange, and China, 1 billion Chinese, less than 9 million Israelis, and yet they are a world player. And it primarily comes down to innovation. There are 350 multinational R&D facilities in Israel, Google, Intel. Intel said that Intel is as much an Israeli company now as it is a US company because of technology. The list goes on and on. Israel raises more venture capital every year than all of Europe combined. Israel has more availability of scientists and engineers and lawyers, for better or worse, than any other country in the world. I mean, it is staggering what this country has achieved in less than 70 years, now ranked consistently as a top innovation country in the world. To the point where there are so many startups, it has now been dubbed the Startup Nation. 6,000 plus startups. There are more startups here per capita than anywhere else in the world, and I think more than anywhere outside of Silicon Valley in absolute numbers. And yet all of this in spite of the fact that Israel is that little red speck in the middle of the map here. It's the size of New Jersey. I think you could fit like 3 of these things into Kansas. It has the same population as New York City on a Monday afternoon. It is surrounded by lukewarm friends at best, hostile enemies at worst. It's the only Jewish nation in the world amidst Muslim and Arab countries. It has everything going against it. It has absorbed more immigrants per capita than any country in the world. It's 70 years young. So it would be understandable if it was a nothing of a country, but that's not what it is. When it comes to especially what I call global impact technology, it is a game changer. What are global impact technologies? World-changing, life-sustaining technologies. And also not up here are cyber tech. Israel is like 20% of the world's cyber market, med tech. But I'm focused on these with my company, welaunch. Clean tech, Israel's ranked consistently as a top contender in the world. Ag tech, last year AgriFunder News named Israel as the most important ag tech center outside of America. Food tech, and for our purposes here, water technology. I believe that water is the shining jewel in the crown of Israeli innovation, and that's what I want to talk to you about for the remaining time I have here with you. Israel, water, and we'll start with wow, because we're going to get to how have they done this, and then we're going to get to now what do we do with this, how does it impact you all here in Kansas or the region. But first I do want to begin with water. There's a great setup from a gentleman who asked the question in the previous session about how do you convey the importance of water to religious-minded folks. Well, here's how. And what I'm sharing with you isn't religious. 80% of Israelis are secular, but nonetheless, they look to the Bible for their history, for their texts, for their values. And you don't have to look very far in the Bible to see water. Water is there at the outset of the creation story. It's the only thing that's there when God begins to create. If you look at the 7 days of creation, regardless of what you believe about it, how we tell a story says a lot about who we are as a people. So again, religion aside, this is a textbook on water. 5 of the 7 days are about water or dealing with water. There isn't a close second in the creation story. It's said that Eskimos have 32 words for snow because they have a rich experience of snow. I only have 2 words, and they're not nice, and I'm not saying them. And I was a little hesitant to move to Colorado, but what are you going to do? The Bible has hundreds of words for water, permutations and variations. There are actually 600 uses of the word mayim, which is the Hebrew word for water, because it's a rich, profound experience. Unfortunately, in the Bible and in that part of the world, oftentimes water scarcity. Moses brings the Israelites out of Egypt, and what's the first thing they do? Here's a good Yiddish word, kvetch, complain. Yiddish is great for complaining and telling naughty jokes. So if you want to learn the swear words in Yiddish, I'll tell you them after this. Poor Moses is almost brought to his knees over water and trying to feed and give water to these people. And it pretty much doesn't change because 3,500 years later, Mark Twain visits Israel. And then one of the most famous travel books in history writes Innocents Abroad. And in it, he essentially kvetches. He complains about what the Israelites were complaining about. This place is lacking water and resources. He called it a desolate country, a silent, mournful expanse. It's called the land of milk and honey. And it may be true. I didn't see that much milk or that much honey. Pretty much a lot of vegans now drinking soy milk over there. But it definitely is not a place of water. As a sign of, show of hands, how many of you have been to Israel? Good. A lot of fresh meat to come with us on the Aqua Nation tour. If you go to Israel, you'll see this place. It's called the Dead Sea. By Kansas standards, it's pretty much the salty pond. If you go to this place, the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus walked, you'll really think of this more as a lake That's pretty much what it is. I'm not sure it's exactly a sea. The Jordan River. The Jordan River, this is at its most narrow point. Senator Henry Jackson in the 70s visited it, and he said, this must be one of the greatest PR campaigns of all time, to call this thing Jordan River. Or Henry Kissinger said, this is a river with more reputation than water. And it's true. In Israel, when I was living there, I've lived there 3 or 4 different times. 20 years ago, we would constantly be listening on the news channel as to where the red line was for the Sea of Galilee. That was where they drew most of their water to drink. And there was concern because it was getting lower and lower, and if you get below the low red line, there's permanent damage to the ecosystem. Every single day, it was the talk of the town. Today, nobody listens. Ironically, Israel's in the midst of a 6 or 7 year drought. Sounds familiar. And nobody's really talking about the red line. If they are, it's not about existential talk, life or death. It would be understandable if I were going to stand here for the next 28 minutes and fetch and complain, and Tracy would say, why did I invite Dr. B, Rabbi B, this B guy, and I wouldn't be invited back. But it would be understandable because this is Israel. Israel's 60% arid or desert. It's 40% semi-arid. If Israel was a state in the United States, ranked by rainfall, it would be in dead last, behind Nevada. The last place for rainfall in the United States, the city, is, I think, Las Vegas. I think they get a city over 100,000. I think they get 5 inches of rain a year. That star in the middle is the capital of the south, the Negev Desert. It's called Beersheba. It's also the cyber capital of the world now. And if that were ranked as a city, it would come in number 281. They get less than 4 inches of rain a year. So again, it would be understandable if I sat here and talked to you about the brown Israel, dying Israel, like Egypt and Jordan. To the north is Lebanon, to the northeast is Syria. They're brown. That's a recent satellite image. But that's not what you see when you look at Israel. What you see is a green country. In fact, Israel's the only country in the world with receding deserts. Its deserts are getting smaller. As every other country has experienced desertification, Israel's deserts are dwindling. Israel has a net gain of trees, by the way, the only country in the world to have a net gain of trees over the past 100 years. Israel is no longer water scarce. Israel is water abundant. They export now billions of gallons of water to Jordanians and to Palestinians. As an aside, we call it hydro-diplomacy, because I don't have any faith in religion or politics to pave the way to peace, but I have deep belief that water and hydro-diplomacy can pave the way. Israel now exports billions of gallons a year because it is water abundant. Israel, I don't know if it's the first or only, but it is a country that has declared itself independent from the climate for its water. In 2013, it declared itself as water independent and ending 3,500 plus years of water scarcity. And I think it's a wow. In fact, I think it's such a wow that I've kind of dubbed this country called the Aqua Nation. And Israel is, if not the only, one of the only global water superpowers. And that's what I want to talk to you about. Because I do not work for the Israel Ministry of Economy or Ministry of Tourism. If I did, I would do a heck of a lot better job than they are doing selling Israel. I'm not here to sell you on the wow. I'm here to talk to you about how. And as we go through the rest of this talk, don't think replication, as somebody in the previous session was talking about. It may not be replicable from Israel to the US or to Kansas. Some of it will be. Let's talk best practice. But in the process, don't think replication, think inspiration, because that's my goal and job, is to inspire some of these practices to make their way into this region and particularly into this state. So how has Israel become a water superpower? It began in the 1800s, in fact. This is Theodore Herzl. He's the ideological founder of the modern state of Israel. And he saw the coming storm, the coming of the Holocaust about 50 years later. Unfortunately, he was right. And he was warning Jews to get out of Europe, to go to the Jewish homeland, to reconstitute the Jewish homeland. He knew in order to have a functional, vibrant Jewish homeland, you needed 2 things. You need defense, because it's a tough neighborhood, and you need water, because it's a dry neighborhood. And so he wrote and talked and preached about, and he was a secular person, about the importance of water. In fact, he wrote a work of fiction about returning to the land of Israel. And in this work of fiction, he portrayed water engineers as heroes and visionaries, right? You can go home and tell your spouse, I am a hero because I am dealing in water, and that is an important message we need to get across. Well, he got that across. One of his successors, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, was obsessed with water, particularly making the desert bloom, in his words. And so David Ben-Gurion spent his entire life advocating for water, preaching about water, and investing into water, and surrounding himself with people who knew more about water than he did. You probably don't know this man or his name. His name is Simcha Blas, but many of you know his product. His invention was called drip irrigation. He's the father of drip irrigation, and I'll tell you more about that. But prior to being the father of drip irrigation, he was tasked with an extraordinary challenge in 1939. What was happening in 1939 around the world? If you're a Jew, you're very familiar with this. This was the beginning of the Holocaust. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass in Europe, set off what ultimately became the demise of 6 million Jews, men, women, and children, went up in the ovens of Auschwitz as smoke because they were burnt and killed to death. They had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. So they wanted to go to Israel, and the Israelis who were living there, it wasn't called Israel, it's called Palestine, weren't allowed to bring in their brothers and sisters because the British occupied Israel, and they were placating the Arabs during the Arab boycotts, so they had quotas on how many immigrants could come to Israel. There was no place for Jews to go. The Israelis who were living there at the time understood one of the quotas was built around water. If you can't feed and water your people, you can't bring them here, said the British. So the Israelis tasked Simcha Blas and others with the fantasy plan. They were racing against the clock to create an infrastructure of water that would allow for more than the 15,000 meager souls allowed into the land of Israel. And they started investing heavily in the national water carrier. The national water carrier was an attempt to bring water from the semi-water-rich north down to the water-deprived south. They spent every ounce of resources they had in building this thing. They spent so much that it was dubbed the Champagne Pipeline, because adjusted for inflation and per capita, the Israelis at that time spent more than the Panama Canal, the most expensive public works project, I believe, in modern history, at least until that point. Israelis spent 6 times that amount to build this water infrastructure, more than the Hoover Dam, more than the Golden Gate Bridge. And remember, this was a country that was broken, and it was attacked, and it was poor, and it had absorbing more immigrants than it knew what to do with, and yet they invested mightily in water planning and infrastructure, and building simultaneously in the 30s and 40s a national wastewater system, treating water. Israelis have been obsessed with treating water, using the water that they have for now over 80 years. There are countries that are only waking up to the importance of these two investments and efforts. The Israelis weren't even a country, and yet they were focused very heavily on water. And it pays off. It pays in dividends, because today, this is Israel. Israel recycles, reuses 90% of its water. There isn't a close second. I believe Spain is number 2 at 20%. The U.S. is, I don't know what it is, but it's way down the line. This wasn't my slide. But it's not impressive. What Israel has done with water is impressive. They treat 100% of their water. They recycle or reuse 90% of it. Most of that goes to irrigating crops. Now, farmers, irrigators prefer reused water than fresh water, because of a lot of nutrients that are left over, and because it's on demand. As much or as little as they need is available to them, particularly during times of crisis and water scarcity like today. So it always strikes me, people want to jump to desalination and finding new water, but let's talk about the water that we actually have in hand and use it well, use it properly, and yes, then let's move on to new sources of water. David Ben-Gurion called it desalting the water, but he believed deeply, as I already mentioned, in the imperative of finding new sources of water, and that's what Israel has done. Ben-Gurion never lived to see his dream realized, but today Israel is the desalination nation. It's too much of a mouthful, but you get the point. And here's why. As a very important aside, There was a man named Sidney Loeb. Maybe you've heard of him. He is truly the father of reverse osmosis. He's a Kansas boy, a Kansas Jewish boy. He was born in Kansas. He started this kind of reverse osmosis revolution. I think that the idea was around for much longer than he was, but he really birthed it into our reality. He then went off to California, I believe, and nobody was really interested, but then he met the Israelis and they were very interested. He ended up moving to Israel, making Aliyah, becoming an Israeli citizen. And there they adopted it. And between 2005 and 2013, Israel built 5 desalination plants. I just heard a staggering statistic. California has 30 some odd desalination plants, and I don't think one of them right now is online. I don't know if that's true, but it's shocking and it says a lot. Israel has 5 of them online. One of them is the world's largest and most efficient. It's called Sorek. It's an impressive facility in Sorek, Israel. Israel now desalinates 60% of its water. Almost all of its drinking water does or could come from desalination. And it's not just seawater. I talk to folks in the Midwest and they say, it's not relevant to Kansas. Last I checked, Clinton Lake, as I remember, outside of Lawrence, wasn't a ocean, and I don't think it was salt water. It is relevant because it's not the only type of desalination. Brackish water desal. There are trillions of gallons of water in the desert. It's not true that there's no water. You just got to be able to locate it and extract it and utilize it, and that's what Israel does. It's not all about technology and infrastructure. It's also about culture and education. The previous discussion in here was right on. We've got to change the way we think about water. In Israel, water is treated very differently than here. There are nursery rhymes in Israel that are clapping and singing and celebrating water. I mean, just think about the ways we portray water and teach water to our children, and as a culture, the negative stereotypes and images and just disrespect for water. In Israel, it doesn't exist. You've had conserving water campaigns going on for years. This is Every Drop Counts campaign from years back. This is Baruch HaLevi, a famous Israeli model. There are campaigns all the time in Israel on TV and billboards. It's called Israel Drying Out. It's like The Walking Dead. It's terrifying, but they take it very seriously. In Israel, water is life or death. And outside of Israel, I was raised with one of these on my shelf. Any Jewish people in here? In Manhattan, Kansas. I'm shocked. Not one? One. So you might recognize this. I certainly recognize it when I talk in New York City. They all recognize it. JNF, the Jewish National Fund, is a global organization. And for 125 years, they've put these on mantles in Jewish people's home, maybe non-Jewish people's home. We put quarters in them. And for 125 years, those quarters have gone to planting trees in Israel. Now to date, building, I think, 250 water reservoirs in Israel, quarter by quarter. As important as the infrastructure investment is, so is the importance of indoctrinating and educating your constituents about the power of water. Governance. Now, especially on this slide, don't think replication, think inspiration. Israel began as a socialist experiment. It is now no longer socialistic. Thank God. It is individualistic, capitalistic, which is why it is the startup nation. It wouldn't have gotten there if it was socialism. There are a few hangovers. This is, by the way, a kibbutz, a collective living. That's the hora, a collective dance. Those days are gone by. My kids who are Israeli said they once in their life have never danced the hora. They only dance hip hop. So this is days gone by. However, there are 3 hangovers of socialism in Israel, at least as I can tell. Medicine, which everybody debates, and I think it's a worse system, not a better system. Another conversation for another day. Military service, it's a necessity. Every Israeli serves in the IDF, the Israeli military. And then water. Interestingly, water is the only one that nobody debates. It is still essentially socialistic, at least as far as management, governance, and infrastructure, certainly not the private sector of investment and technology. The bottom line is, it was explained to me as such. In Israel, you can put a bucket on your roof in the beginning of the rainy season. By the end of that season, you still own the bucket, but the Israeli people own the water. And that's how Israeli water is treated. Mekorot is the Israeli national water company. It runs in tandem with the Israel Water Authority, which is a technocratic, not a political organization, and they manage essentially the country's water, although it is a private-public partnership with the utilities, but nonetheless, it's still very much a collective mentality. And lastly, money. It's amazing to me, having just moved back to Colorado, how little my water bill was, and I know I used a lot of water. In Israel, you pay the actual price for water. The decision was made over a decade ago to get rid of subsidies. And in that decision, they saw conservation shoot through the roof. I think it nearly doubled overnight, because when you pay for what you use, you treat it differently. Whether or not that will work here, it's certainly food for thought. Innovation. Best quote I found on water innovation by Amir Peleg, an Israeli entrepreneur. There isn't a scarcity of water, there's a scarcity of innovation. This is the important point, I think, right now for us to start thinking about our new ways to do more with less water. In Israel, there are now at least over 200 direct water tech companies, but then you get into ag tech and biotech, cyber, big data, IoT, blockchain. They're all dealing with water now. Water is one of the up-and-coming contenders in Israel, and all these different sectors are starting to focus on it. And you have all areas, I know that's small, but you have all areas that they're looking at: water detection, domestic use, desalination, the list goes on. We need to start really treating innovation differently. One of the secrets to success in Israeli water innovation is that their utilities have basically become beta sites, testing for innovation and technologies. I know, again, it's a lot easier to do when you have one governing body and one governing authority, but nonetheless, we need to think about ways to introduce technology into our utilities here in America, and I'll get there at the end of this conversation. And investment capital, you have to have people willing to invest. Another conversation maybe for another time. As an outsider to the industry and really learning a lot, you all know more than I do about the industry, it just strikes me as bizarre that we're running around looking for new sources of water and not utilizing the water that we have more wisely. I mean, when it comes to leaks, it's staggering to me at where the world is with regards to leaky infrastructure, old antiquated systems. In some places of the world, they're losing up 60 or 70% of their water just in loss into the ground or because of inefficiency. Even in America, the numbers are not that impressive. 20, 30, 40% loss due to leakage in some places. In Israel, you're south of 10%. Where I was living in Ra'anana, right outside of Tel Aviv, you were around 6% of loss, partially because of Miltel. Israel has monitored all water usage for 50 years. If you have a water source, you must have a meter. That is a definite step up, but to get to the next level, you have to have smart meters. In Israel now, in every house in my suburb of Tel Aviv, you had DMR, distance meter reading. So I would get a text message every time there was suspicious water usage at my house. And sure enough, the hose was left on in the backyard, or there was a leaky pipe, and I would get a text message, and I would go turn it off, and I save money, and we save the environment, and kumbaya. Takadoo's doing the same thing now for utilities here in America. They're an Israeli company. They monitor water through using algorithms like they use in fraud prevention and cybersecurity, looking at suspicious water usage. Amazing technologies. Or Utilis, no longer kind of antiquated listening devices to find water leaks. They're using satellite imaging to find water leaks, leak detection 2.0. Or CuraPipe, just one example of many of ingenious ways to deal with a problematic infrastructure. CuraPipe shoots a polymer into the water system, and it plugs the holes that it finds along the way. Now, the innovation is a spectrum. You go from low tech, this is about as low tech as it gets, dual flush toilets, born in Israel. I don't really usually go around leading with that one, but nonetheless an important innovation. Dual flush toilets. I mean, the number one use of water in our home is flushing toilets. 5 gallons of water, clean water by the way, flushed for 7 ounces of urine. My son's maxim just doesn't hold up though. You know, if it's mellow, let it yellow. If it's brown, flush it down. That's not real functional, but these are functional. In every house, in every place of business in Israel, you have dual flush toilets. So you're adjusting for that. As an aside, I heard a shocking anecdote. In America, we flush 5 gallons of drinking water, on average 5 times a day, 25 gallons of drinking water. In India, they go walking to find drinking water that's usually toilet water. We've got to deal with this problem. Now, that's low tech, but high tech, there's some really cool stuff happening in the world and in Israel. You know about Lichtot? Lichtot is a company, this is their minimal product, fits on a keychain, and it's like $50. It uses electromagnetic waves or something beyond my pay grade, but it detects water quality. For anybody who wants to know if the water you're drinking is, as we say, kosher, fit, proper, Lichtot is a very cool technology. Here's one of my favorites. You heard about WaterGen? 2 Israeli guys out on patrol in their Jeep, their Humvee, thinking about they don't have enough water. I guess the Humvee had air conditioning, which was shocking as I think about it. But nonetheless, the story is still impressive. It's dripping water, and the idea was born. There's water. There's plenty of water. We don't have a water scarcity problem. We have a water innovation problem. Where's the water? It's around us. It's called humidity. So they created WaterGen. WaterGen is now up and functional. It takes water out of thin air, fills up a cup, purifies it right in front of you. You drink it. It is unbelievable. It's a game changer. Think about bypassing antiquated infrastructure by drawing water out of the air. FEMA now acquired the rights, and they're dropping this off at FEMA sites. They can only handle a few thousand gallons a day, but someday, this is exponential thinking. Linear is, what we're doing today is what we'll get tomorrow. This is exponential, jumping the curve, total degrees of innovation far beyond where we are now. Game-changing technologies. I was watching one of my kids' shows a while back, and they were talking about water conservation, and make sure you turn off the faucet when you brush your teeth. I'm thinking, this is ridiculous. It's important from a cultural, educational perspective, but it's not moving the needle because 70% of our water is going to agriculture right now. We've got to start with the important areas like agriculture. We have experts in this room far smarter than I on irrigation, but the world uses mostly flood irrigation. Even in America, they're still using flood irrigation. I just met with some cotton farmers down in Oklahoma, still using flood irrigation. It is inefficient, we know that. It's mostly evaporation of water, waste of water, runoff of water. It's also negligent in this day and age. When we're dealing with water scarcity, we've got to improve, and sprinkler irrigation is a marked improvement above flood. But then there are new technologies, which I would argue are even more important, like drip irrigation. Israel's the birthplace of drip irrigation. Back to the beginning slide. Simcha Blas in the 30s was out in a field, I guess like this one. This isn't the actual field. And he saw an anomaly. Trees and vegetation in one area, but the rest, nothing. And he went, and through some investigation, he found a leaky pipe, a hole in a pipe. And thus, Netafim was born. Netafim was the first, I still think it's the largest company in the world to be manufacturing drip irrigation. Israel now is 90% drip irrigation, 10% center pivot or sprinkler. And there's no doubt about it that drip irrigation has a tremendous amount to offer the world. I don't want to argue, is it center pivot or is it drip irrigation? Whatever it might be, drip irrigation has so much to offer. I've met with folks in Nebraska who say, yeah, but we don't have a water scarcity problem. You don't have a water scarcity problem yet. You actually do, but that's another conversation. But they've found that drip irrigation, drip by drip by drip, increases yield. In the Netherlands, they just did a study. It's increasing yield anywhere from 50% to 500%. It certainly gets you back to where you were, and in the process, we know it saves water, something like 50 to 90% water savings and reduction. But then you get into areas like fertigation, delivering fertilizers drip by drip. I went to a conversation about algae bloom. You're then now preventing that from happening and all of the consequences of the runoffs. You're into nutrigation, which means you can deliver nutrients straight to the plant, which means you can grow plants in the soil, in the sand, which is how Israel is turning back the deserts. And it reduces carbon footprint. You can argue how much or how little. Nonetheless, there are new technologies to do more with less. That's the slogan of Netafim. In 1939, Hazara, Israel's seed co-op, was born, once again out of necessity. The Arab boycott wouldn't allow for Israelis to buy their own seeds, so they had to become masters of seed science. Today, Israel's the world leader in crop yield to water ratio, simply out of necessity. Israel does things like, and this is again not my area of expertise, but they breed wheat with shorter stalks to use less resources. If you go down to the desert, you see these little palm trees with bananas on them. It's like it's made for like kids to go up and pick, but they eliminate the trunk because it's water intensive. They breed cherry tomatoes were born in Israel, but they breed them in clusters with less leaves, using less resources. They grow now plants with shorter roots to work in tandem with drip irrigation, so it's an on-demand system, and it's getting smarter all the time. And these are some pretty smart companies, which is why they all have R&D centers in Israel, because of seed science. So Shimon Peres said, through creativity and innovation, we transform barren deserts into flourishing fields, pioneered new frontiers filled with clean, abundant, economical water. I'm not going to leave you with that. I'm going to leave you with this, from how to now. Now what do we do with this? And in order to do that, I got to tell you a joke. It's not funny, but I'm clergy. That's what we do. And you'll have to laugh just out of discomfort. A meteor is going to hit the Earth in 3 days' time. It's going to hit the Atlantic Ocean. It's going to cause mass flooding. So all the groups gather to do what they do. Some pray, some do yoga, some have parties, and the Jews get together. First, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. They argue. Who's going to run this meeting? Whose synagogue is it going to be at? And then who's going to have the luncheon afterwards? Are we going to have lox and bagel? Finally, a woman, a little old lady, grabs the microphone and says, look, we have 3 days to learn how to live underwater. Let's get busy. We have 3 days to learn how to live underwater, or 3 decades, or 3 years, whatever it might be. Water scarcity is here, right? I don't meet people who deny climate change anymore, and if they do and they want to debate me from a religious perspective, well, they're disappointed to find out it's a doctor of divinity. So we have a problem. It's not a problem, it's a crisis. By 2050, we're going to have 2 more billion people adding to a problem that we already can't handle. 1 billion people in this world right now don't have access to fresh, potable water. Another billion don't have access to sewage systems that are functional or even existent. I read a statistic that by 2020 or 2025, 40 out of 50 states in America are going to have serious shortage on water. The stats go on. The picture is clear. And that's why we formed welaunch. welaunch is a nonprofit based in, Nebraska, but we are now spread throughout the Silicon Prairie, and I'll explain that. And our mission is to connect the startup nation with the Silicon Prairie, with the U.S. Midwest. What is the Silicon Prairie? Why the Silicon Prairie? You all are beautiful, holy, wonderful Midwesterners, and you have tremendous values that I aspire and espouse out in the world, but one of your assets is not boasting rights, bragging rights. You just don't do that in the Midwest. Well, we got to take a little playbook from the Israelis. It's called chutzpah. It's called audacity. We've got to tell a better story about ourselves. The Midwest? What does that mean anyways? We're in the middle, we're not the West, we're not the East, we should be the Mideast. The Mideast is already taken. We need a new story, a new narrative. We are the Silicon Prairie. Did you know that individually, Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, they would never be ranked as contenders on the world stage? But in their aggregate, even some of these states, GDP would make us the 4th or 5th largest country in the world. I can't sell Kansas to Israelis. I can, one off here, one off there. They're going to Boston. 4% last year of Boston's GDP were Israeli technology companies. $9 billion in direct revenue. 3,000 jobs. I can't get them to come here, but I can get them to come to Nebraska and Kansas and Iowa and the Silicon Prairie, because as a network, we are impressive. We are 25 to 35% of the world's Fortune 500 companies here in the Silicon Prairie. We are 9 out of 10 agricultural leaders in this country. Yeah, the West Coast has California. Give them California. We have 2 through 10. When it comes to energy, when it comes to food production, when it comes to the Ogallala Aquifer, they need to be in the Silicon Prairie, and I can sell the Silicon Prairie with all due respect to Nebraska, Iowa, or Kansas individually. And that's what we're doing. We're focused on water. We're focused on facilitating relationships around water. Relationships are how you build anything, especially in the Midwest, in the Silicon Prairie, and in Kansas. You all know, and I know, this isn't New York City, thank God. This isn't Los Angeles. This is the Midwest, and we have to begin by meeting one another, getting to know one another, trust one another, so we facilitate relationships. One of the ways we do that is through tours, bringing over Ag Tech Tour. Your governor sent over a delegation on an Ag Tech Tour last year. We're going to be running an Aqua Nation tour later this year, bringing over Israelis on water roadshows, water tech roadshows here to Kansas, and of course, some initiatives in the remaining time that I don't have. Couple last points. The governor of Colorado had the vision to start a fund with an Israeli organization, and they're investing in Israeli water tech, bringing them to Colorado, introducing them to the utilities. It's a visionary play. It's happening now in Maryland and around the country. We're putting together versions of this in Oklahoma, where we're looking at new creative ways to finance technology and water infrastructure change. We don't have the answer, but we do have models out there. And now we're here in Kansas, and that's what we're looking to do. welaunch is looking to build those relationships with Kansans around water. And that's why I'm here this week, looking for water heroes, looking for men and women like you, engineers, water engineers, and innovation folks. We're looking for great organizations like this one and leaders in your communities. You can pay me later, Tracy. You got farmers here that we're meeting with, irrigators that are becoming our partners, utilities and CEOs and VCs, investment private equity. We're meeting with economic development organizations and governors-elect. I just wanted to cover all my bases. To fulfill this ancient mandate, right? As I began the story about the Israelites complaining, what was God's response to Moses? Not here's desalted water, not here's the solution to your problems, not we're going to pick you up and move you to Hawaii. What did God say to Moses? God said, take your staff and strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. In a nutshell, God said, I gave you a brain, use it. I gave you hands, get going. I gave you feet, get moving. Figure out your solutions, and that's what we're going to do. We have 3 decades or 3 years or 3 days, but whatever it is, we're going to have to learn to live without water or learn to live with less water. So that is what we believe that this great state and this country of Israel can do together. We can figure out our problems. We can get busy finding solutions to our water scarcity challenge. And I had to end with this. I'm sorry. Rock Chalk, Jayhawk. Okay, yeah.